I made that mistake, unfortunately, and she ended up passing a couple days later. I know that I didn't do justice to her. So I quickly realized that EMS is where I belonged because they're smart people. If your child is between 1 and 8 years of age, give it. Her heart rate went through the roof. Her blood pressure went through the roof. The monitor is just going off.
And I grew up like wrestling, and then I got into other martial arts as a kid.
The feelings that I felt were, I was so ashamed and I was embarrassed. And that's when I made my first tenfold medication error. And it was because I was nervous.
Welcome to the Next Orbit podcast, where connecting healthcare's data is the next frontier. We take you inside conversations with policymakers, healthcare leaders, disruptors, and visionaries who are pushing boundaries in a system that resists change. Explore how modern technology can remove barriers and improve care at scale. It's about ditching inertia and building smarter. For insiders, innovators, and anyone ready to navigate what's next, this is your launchpad. Here is your host, Ben Wade.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the Next Orbit podcast. My guest today is a pioneer in pediatric and EMS care, and we've invited him on today to discuss his innovations, his leadership in emergency medicine, and the transformative impacts those innovations are having on pre-hospital care. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Peter Antevy onto the show. Thank you for being here, Peter.
Awesome, Ben, Mike, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to flip our script a little bit here. And I want to start with talking about what you've built and the solution that you're bringing to market. It rhymes with your name, so it's Handtevy. But yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about that and what it's used for in the EMS space.
Sure. So in short, if you have a pediatric or an adult patient who is in cardiac arrest, having a seizure, Handtevy helps you get the exact dose of medication that you need to treat their condition. It gives you the exact size of the equipment that they would need. Let's say they have to be intubated. And it also houses all of that agency's protocols, checklists. If they have to go to a certain location, a hospital that has a cardiac facility, it helps direct them there as well. So it's really meant for use right at the patient's side while the event is happening.
Yeah, can you take us through a little bit of how it came to be? How was it done before? It sounds like any physician or caregiver would want to have that information on a coded patient before they arrive at the hospital. So what was the process like before Handtevy was around?
Yeah, so I trained at two of the top 10 children's hospitals in the country. And when you're training there, what they do is they tell you that when a child comes in and presents to the emergency department, in order to figure out the average weight of that child, there is a measuring tape. Just think of it like a 6-foot long piece of tape that you start at the child's head and then you measure all the way down to the feet. When you get to the feet, there's wherever that box lands, where the edge of the child's foot is, you actually have medication doses and equipment sizes. The problem is that it doesn't give you the final answer. What do I mean by that? The actual physician or nurse, when you give a medication to a child, it's a volume, right? 1 ml, 2 mLs, etc. On this tape, because it doesn't know the concentration of drug in the vial, it only gives you the milligram dose, and then you then have to do another calculation to get to the final volume. Mm-hmm. So what was happening is that you could have a kid who's in cardiac arrest in front of you. The nurse, and this happened to me in real life, the nurse literally brought me this 6-foot long piece of tape, which they had encased in wood because people were stealing it. So here I am at the head of the bed with a 6-foot long piece of wood that if I turned the way would hit like 3 people. And then you have to look at the little box and then do another math equation to get just one volume correct. And the reason that this whole thing started is because in 2005, after leaving those 2 ivory towers, let's call them, I found myself here at a very good children's hospital, tertiary care center, but not an academic center by any means. And that's when I made my first tenfold medication error. And it was because I was nervous. They brought me that long, piece of wood, if you will, and I pointed at the drug, but that drug was not for that right indication. And I ended up giving, instead of 0.2 mLs, I gave 2 mLs. Now, that girl, her heart rate went through the roof. Her blood pressure went through the roof. The monitor is just going off. It's not stopping. And the mom kept saying, why is this monitor keep alarming? And I said, oh, no, that's just because we gave her medicine that'll do that. It was epinephrine. She was having severe anaphylaxis. And I didn't realize right at that moment what I had done. That girl ended up in the ICU, and she ended up doing okay. And I remember when I finally realized what I had done, the feelings that I felt were, I was so ashamed and I was embarrassed of myself, because I was supposed to be this well-trained physician who came in from Los Angeles and Pittsburgh and etc. And I found myself just feeling very incompetent. And then about a month later, 7 a.m. shift, a little baby comes in cardiac arrest, and they present me with that long piece of wood again. So you can imagine, guys, that after going through this, and I have very little anxiety. I'm not an anxious person, but at this moment in my life, I felt like I was in trouble, that I didn't really know what I was doing. And I knew I had to change that and figure something out, and it was urgent for me.
So, Peter, no, I appreciate you sharing that. I'm having a hard time, I guess, understanding how the medications make it to the room where the patient is when they arrive in the hospital. Is this, when you pull out that wooden stick in the old ways of doing things, when you pulled out that wooden stick and you landed on a medication dose that was appropriate, are there just bags of these different solutions mixed up all ready to go in the room? Or what's we't's for getting the proper medication administered to the patient? And we've got to remember, this is a patient that's coding usually, and time is of
the essence, right? Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? I wish that you and the audience could see the videos in the code room, but I'll try to describe it for you. And there's always, that one room in the emergency department that's different from all the other rooms. It's where all the sickest people go. Either you're in cardiac arrest, you're coding, or you're septic, you're having a seizure. It's where you go when we don't have time to go put orders in the computer, let the pharmacist verify it, send down the medication, have the nurse scan the barcode. Like, none of that is happening in this room. So what they've done is they put in that room a cart, the code cart. And the code cart has a number of drawers. And the very top of that drawer are basically the primary medications that you would use during a resuscitation. So they're kind of sitting there in vials. Oftentimes kids need an infusion, and those infusions usually have to be made. In other words, they don't come really ready-made. You have to make them up. And once you make that infusion, then you have to figure out, well, how fast does that infusion have to go into a 1-year-old, 3-year-old, 5-year-old? But you have these medications sitting there in the room, not all of them, just the first line, if you will. At the head of the bed, and I'm evaluating the patient, and I verbally will call out for medications. And so if I just say I need epinephrine, 100 times out of 100, someone's going to say, well, what dose? And then they follow that up with, well, what volume is that? And that's where they kind of made this long tape. And in this particular case, they have to hand it to you. But when you're at the head of the bed and you're trying to run the code and manage everybody, and mom and dad are typically, I bring them in right next to me, that's not what you want your doctor to be doing. You want your doctor to be saying, here's what I need. And someone says, I'm getting it for you. I need a chest tube. Let's intubate. Let's get epi, amiodarone. Let's do a norepi drip. And it happens that quickly, you need people to say right back to you, I'm getting it. Now, if that medication is in that top drawer, they'll pull it out, but now they need a volume. So what happens is now there's an interchange between physician and nurse while the kid is dying, because the nurse doesn't have that math, because the math was never done for anybody. So you find yourself now in a conversation that you shouldn't be having. You should be focusing on the kid and the rest of the room. So what ends up happening when you see people who are not good at resuscitation, or their room is not set up the right way, or they don't have a product like Handtevy, the tensions start to mount and they start to build, and people's voices start getting louder, and the parents start getting more nervous, and they're pacing, and you see people running in and out of the room. So if you saw a video of the code room, with no voice, just on mute, you could tell in 2 seconds whether they have their stuff together or not. And the folks who don't have their stuff together, people start doing things just because they don't want to be the one that everyone's looking at. And it becomes very busy and very moving. And sometimes kids have an error of commission. That was the error that I made, one of the errors I made, where I gave 10 times more. But maybe more important and maybe more frequent are the errors of omission, which means that you know that a kid needs a drug, but they don't get it because no one knows how to get there. I made that mistake, unfortunately, where I knew a kid needed an infusion to get her blood pressure up, but I knew that mom and dad were right next to me. If I would have said, I need a norepi drip, the nurses would have said, what dose? How do you want to run it? How do we mix it? I didn't know any of that, and neither did they. So they had to call Steve in pharmacy. And, unfortunately, Steve didn't get me the medication for 20 to 30 minutes. By that time, I was already up in the ICU with this girl who still has a very low blood pressure, and her level of consciousness was deteriorating. And unfortunately, that girl didn't make it. And she ended up passing a couple of days later. Now, could I have told myself that this girl was very sick and it wouldn't have mattered? You could tell yourself, but I know that I didn't do justice to her. And I didn't do good by her or her family. And so your initial question was, how does this all go down? I now have the privilege of going to hospitals around this country, and I see exactly how it goes. And you can go to the best hospitals in this country, the best, and you can drop a 3-year-old in cardiac arrest. And if they're not prepared and they don't have all the dosing pre-planned and they haven't been coached, it's like you dropped a grenade in the room. So no one is immune from this, unfortunately. But to your point earlier, the fact that this is even a question is still so interesting of a topic for me to talk about here in 2025.
So, Peter, one of the things that I'd love to hear about is, because it sounds like it's a matter both of kind of having the knowledge in the room when it's needed and time. Like, you don't want to spend, like you said, 30 minutes is too long, and not having that knowledge might put you in that situation where it's going to take 30 minutes. So can we talk a little bit about how Handtevy addresses that? And kind of how you got there, I think would be really great to hear, because what you've described is, as a parent, something that is chilling and something that I'd be concerned about. Like, now I know if I start seeing them charge around like it looks on TV, that I probably better be concerned, right? So that's what I don't want to see. I want to see people, yes, being quick about it, but also not being kind of hurrying because they don't know what to do.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll tell you that after my first 2 errors, I was stressing out, and I said, I have to figure out a way of figuring out the dose quickly, as you just mentioned. And having a tape, the problem with the tape is that the kid is already in front of you. But in every emergency department today, when they're bringing in a kid by EMS, specifically the sicker kids, you have 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes prep time. And what I found was that we had heard a kid was coming in. We had no idea what to prep for because everyone's waiting to measure the kid. Now, back in Pittsburgh is one of my greatest mentors, Robert Hickey. And Bob used to come into the room back in Pittsburgh, and he never used the length-based tape. And he would say to the nurses, how old is this kid? 3. He says, okay, let's get epi 1.5 mLs, drop amiodarone, that's 1.5 mLs. Let's have dextrose ready, that's 30 mLs. And I'm looking at the guy and I'm thinking, man, he is just wicked smart. I didn't really question him then in Pittsburgh, but when I got back to Florida and I was having these issues, I called Bob and he said, yeah, I've been using age my entire career. And that's what started me off and to say, all right. So I literally took a piece of paper on one Sunday morning, I'll never forget. This is back when we were still reading newspapers. And I wrote down 5 numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. Those were the ages. And I used some formulas to figure out the weights of those 5 kids. So 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30. So I wrote those ages, I wrote those weights in kilograms, and then I wrote, what are the 5 drugs I would need right now, instantaneously. And I wrote those down and I did the math for all of those 5 columns. And it was at that instant that it hit me that most of the volumes were just a play off of the kilograms. So as an example, a 3-year-old 15-kilogram kid, their epidose was 1.5 mLs. It was just the decimal dance. And all of a sudden I said to myself, I now know in an instant the 5 drug doses as a volume for the 5 most important drugs that happen in a resuscitation. So it was almost like I couldn't even believe that it had happened. The next code comes in. I'm sitting at the head of the bed. The nurses are expecting some incompetent Peter Antevy again. And all of a sudden I start, rocking and rolling with MLs. And literally the nurses were looking at me like, who are you? But I was so embarrassed. I didn't tell them what I had done or how I did it. I folded up that piece of paper. I put it away forever. And about a year and a half goes by. And a nurse says to me, one of the nurses that I'm very close with today, she says, Pete, you got to tell people how you do that. And I said, okay, next week I'm giving a talk on pediatric drowning. My last 2 slides, I'll put that in. So here we come, the last 2 slides. And I start teaching people on my hand. I said, everyone, put up your right hand. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. And the whole crowd is doing it. Some guy in the audience, as a joke, yelled out Handtevy. My last name is Antevy. They said Handtevy. I hated it initially. But at the end of that talk, guys, 50 people out of the 200 lined up. And I said, whoa, was my drowning talk that good? It wasn't. They all wanted my last 2 slides. There were doctors, nurses, paramedics. So I came home to my wife and I'm like, I got to tell you something. I figured out this thing a little while back and I just had this reaction. And she's like, all right, we'll go do something about it. So I took that white sheet of paper that I'd made and I created it into a little badge buddy that locks onto the lanyard. And I went to FedEx. I printed up a bunch of copies. I laminated them and I, slicing them myself and I put the hole in them. I brought like 20 of them to work and literally they were gone. I said, what? Every nurse now has a badge buddy. I said, okay, maybe I'll bring more in. I brought more in. They were coming down from the ICU. They were coming down from recovery. They were coming down from the OR. And then I said to myself, this is incredible, right? People started asking me to give another talk and another talk. Next thing you know, I'm giving talks in Las Vegas and California, and I'm bringing boxes of these badge buddies. I dropped the box down on the stage. I said, whoever wants one. People are coming, I'll take 5 of them for my friends. And then I'm doing this for just a couple of years, just going and teaching people this little trick. And I'm not charging anybody anything. I wasn't charging for nothing. I'm not a good business guy. And from there, people started saying, listen, you only have a few drugs on here, but we have like 35 or 40 drugs when I became an EMS medical director. And that's when I moved into creating a larger book for my firefighter and paramedics. And then people kept saying, hey, we need an app. And I said, what app? And in 2016, we finally built the first app. So that's the progression of something that started from a big error that I had made.
No, it's a great story. And, sounds like you got rid of the wooden stick and the tape, which was a big accomplishment. But I guess I still have a question on why was it always done by height? And now that you've shifted to look at age as a way to speed things up, all kids come in different shapes and sizes. Even my own children have fallen in various different places on the growth scale. And so, going by age, how can you guarantee that you have the right volume just based on age? And how does that work? I mean, just somebody who's not a doctor.
Yeah, these are great questions. So I'll start off with something that everyone knows, which is the EpiPen Junior. You can go to the pharmacy today and you can get an EpiPen Junior. And if you read the back of the box, it says, if your child is between 1 and 8 years of age, give it. What does that mean? It means you're overdosing the 1-year-old according to the dosing, because a 1-year-old gets 0.1 milligrams. The EpiPen is 0.15 milligrams. The 8-year-old needs 0.27 milligrams. You're giving them 0.15. What does that tell you? It's this concept of a therapeutic window. Every drug has a therapeutic window. So that means if you're a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, or a 5-year-old, you don't have to give the exact amount of drug to each individual person. If you have their exact weight, amazing. That's great. But in the emergency setting, what we do in EMS and what I do in the emergency department, you have kids who are coming in and they just throw the kid down on the bed, and then you got to go to work. And so it doesn't really matter if the kid, what their actual body weight is. So for many years, we go along with ideal body weight. So going back to your question about height, it's been shown and it's known that if you have a 3-year-old who's of a certain height, and then you have a 3-year-old who, let's say, is like Shaquille O'Neal's kid, is like a lot taller, it would make sense that knowing that person's height can give you a better estimation of the weight. And if there were 2 3-year-old kids, one was taller than the other, then the age method obviously wouldn't be as accurate, right? So in the mid-1980s, an amazing doctor named Dr. Broslow, he was a family practice physician working in an ER, was struggling with all these kids coming in, and his teams were flustered. And he came up with this thing of, let me measure the kid. And the first studies came out on the measurement. And, you know, he made an entire career on that tape, right, which benefited many, many children. The one piece that's missing there is the measurement does not give you time to prepare. And it turns out that even if you just gave me 30 seconds before the kid shows up in my ER, or you give a paramedic a few minutes before they show up to the apartment complex where the kid's in cardiac arrest, that is the game-changing moment where you're on scene and you already know what the kid needs. And therefore, we go through this in our course, but if your heart rate comes down and your palms aren't sweaty anymore because you know the information, you know the dose, you know the size, you know the electricity you're going to give, and then you can just walk in, look at mom and dad in the eyes, and they now have confidence that you're the right person for the job, all of a sudden, everything changes. And we go back to the code room where a well-run code room is very calm. The same thing in EMS. If you have a paramedic who comes off the truck and they know the information, they can look you in the eyes, then we end up staying on scene and treating those kids, as opposed to my heart rate's 180, my palms are sweaty, I don't make any eye contact because I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't want to do the math. So what I do is I pick up the kid, and it's called scoop and run, or load and go. Or people joke that the treatment for that kid is diesel fuel. That's what they say. Why? They're so nervous, and they don't want to do the math. They just scoop the kid, rush to the hospital, expecting that they get to the ER, and the people in the ER know better than they do. And they come to find out that they don't. And it's that one little change of using both. Start with age, get the ideal body weight parameters, know what you're going to do before you get there, know the dose of epi, know the size of the endotracheal tube, know how much electricity you're going to give, know those 3 things, and that's what we teach. And you walk in, and now all of a sudden, you can evaluate the child, you could talk to mom and dad, you can do CPR, you could stop the seizure, you could start an IV, all while looking like you actually know what you're doing. So that one little thing was the big game changer. But when I came out in 2010, we started the company, and I said, hey, folks, using age changes everything. That's when they all thought I was completely nuts. They thought I had 3 heads. But I knew, because it's what I did for a living, I knew that if you gave me an age, I was golden. And I had all these people around the country when I'm giving my talks coming and grabbing my badge buddies. So I had product market fit because I saw people were calling me saying, Pete, you wouldn't believe we're on the highway and we had the badge buddy and we treated that kid and the kid's alive today. So I knew that I was right, but the rest of the world didn't want to hear it initially.
Yeah, Pete, I was curious, I'm assuming different drugs have different therapeutic windows like you were talking about. And in a perfect world, you would have a patient's height and weight and everything beforehand. And, if you had an obese child that was outside of was an outlier of the norms, then there's probably some additional concoction that has to go on in the pharmacy to get the right medications. Is that correct or not correct?
Yeah. Listen, I love this high level conversation. It is correct, but there's caveats. Let me explain. You can have a drug like epinephrine that doesn't care how fat you are because it gets distributed to the total body water. So fat kid, skinny kid has the same amount of water. They have different amount of fat. So if you give a water soluble drug, you need to still use ideal body weight. If you use a fat soluble drug, amiodarone is a perfect example, then you would be benefiting the child by giving them actual body weight meds. The problem is that, like, I know that, but in the middle of a resuscitation, to expect that these 5 drugs that are ideal body weight drugs, these 5 drugs are actual body weight drugs, nobody knows that, it turns out. And even when you teach, I have slides on this, and when I start to teach people this, you see the shades start to come down and they start to glaze over. Because at the end of the day, we go to our reptilian brain during a code, it's fight or flight, and I just need to press the easy button. So what I would recommend to people is, if the kid's very large, give them ideal body weight drug. If the drug didn't work, give it again. Some people would say, if they look a little large and you think you're calling them a 3-year-old, bump them up to a 4-year-old. And that's what's been recommended for a long time with a lot of people. But realistically, a lot of these drugs have a big therapeutic window. Where you worry is in the very young children. So everybody could accept a 20% on either end for drug dosing. That's standard of care. But if you think you have a 1 kilo premature kid, the kid's born at 25 weeks, just comes out, and all of a sudden, instead of giving 1 kilo drug, you're giving the kid 3 kilo drugs. Well, that's threefold overdose, right? And it's way more than the 20% you can expect. So as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, the window of concern becomes bigger. And that's where you have to be a little bit more careful. So now in our application, we have 400 grams, 450. We're talking about kids that can fit in the palm of your hand. And we've gone down to 400, 450, 500, 550 grams. And as you get older, then, if the kid's 60 kilos or 55 or 40, it really doesn't matter. You see what I'm saying? So that's the ends of the spectrum really matter there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah. And what I wanted to observe and just see if you kind of agree with this, I'm going to use a weird analogy maybe, but I grew up like wrestling and then I got into other martial arts as a kid. And one of the things you learn from that is like, what you said, first of all, that you kind of get into like when you're actually under pressure, a lot of your techniques and skills start to fall away. And that you have to do that a lot of times under pressure to get used to performing with that kind of pressure on you. The other, though, is that, and this is what I think you might have been saying in your way in the medical field, which is that, what you want to do first is just kind of establish a hold or establish kind of an advantage and then build from there so that particularly kind of in a wrestling discipline so that you're improving your position over time and you aren't kind of in that panic mode. You have a strategy for getting to the end game for you. And it sounds like that's what this does is so it removes the uncertainty in a period of time when you need to be able to feel certain about what the next steps are and buys you the time to do a more thorough analysis while reducing the risk that you'll do something like overdose the patient is kind of what it sounds like to me.
I tell you, I love that analogy. And the one that I use in my talk is the 2-minute drill. And Urban Meyer, I'm a Gator. So Urban Meyer, when he was at the University of Florida, he was breaking down the 2-minute drill. He says at the very beginning, the most important play is the very first play. He says, because everything happens, if you can kind of, make sure that first play goes well, then every other play goes well. So it's exactly, I love that analogy you just gave. And the only way to do that is to have some preparation beforehand. And that's why I tell my paramedics today that the most important time in a pediatric cardiac arrest is before you arrive. And at first it doesn't make a lot of sense, but once you feel it and once we teach it and they do it, it is something that is freeing because you start to understand that, hey, I can do this. I'm not scared of kids anymore. I can look at mom and dad in the eyes. I can have a good outcome and I can have a great career because of it now. So It has really one mistake in a career can derail someone. People die by suicide because of mistakes like this. And the emotional toll of not being able to handle the pediatric patient is so deep, and it can be so problematic that what happens is you get these nurses who come into the ER, PDR, and then they work for a year and then they leave. And I've seen it. I've seen this in and out. And why do they all leave? Because they've had bad calls or bad cases, and they can't take the stress of the math. And this is what we're trying to solve. Not just the saving a life of the child, but saving a life of the health professional taking care of them.
Wow. Yeah.
So you were a children's hospital ER physician, right? But I've done a little research on you, Pete, and it looks like you're heavily involved in the EMS scene now. So can you tell us a little bit about the shift from emergency medicine and in an acute care facility to what you're doing with emergency medical transport today?
I love the question because, a lot of people see fire engines screaming down the street with the lights on. And like, I wonder, is there another fire going on here? And it turns out that when you're an ER doctor, typical shift, I'm seeing 30 to 35 patients. And, there's a lot of non-acute stuff. And then there's, maybe some middle of the road stuff. And then there's a couple of kids a shift who are really sick. And, if you look through an entire career, if you multiply the number of shifts you do, typically 16, 18 times the number of patients times the number of years, you will end up seeing, X thousands of patients in your career. What's very different about EMS is that as a medical director, you now oversee the entire population of your community. And now I started in 2010 with the town of Davie here in South Florida, and then with Coral Springs, and then with Palm Beach County, and then with Brevard County, now Indian River County. So now the population I oversee is about 3 million people. And at one of my agencies, every year we see about 160,000 patients just in one year alone. We do about 60 cardiac arrests a month just in Palm Beach County. So what I realized very quickly is that my brain works a little differently in that if I see something that works, we need to get it done. At the hospital, whether it worked or not didn't matter. You had to figure out ways politically to kind of navigate to get, and the people who are listening who work at a hospital know exactly what I'm talking about. So I quickly realized that EMS is where I belonged because they're smart people, they get it, and we cover a huge population. So just a small example of what we've been able to accomplish in EMS is that I knew that we have a lot of patients who get into car accidents who die on the highway because they're bleeding to death. They're alive when we get there. 50% of them are alive when we get there. But then the other half end up dying because, they needed blood. So we said, well, why can't we just put the blood on the ambulances? And everyone thought we were crazy. But we have a very good track record. Our friends in San Antonio were doing it already. And we convinced our chiefs to put it on the supervisor vehicles. So if you come to Palm Beach County today, for the last 3 years, we have had blood on the trucks. So there's not a day that goes by in my inbox, my email inbox, I review charts where we've given blood or plasma. And we have a 90% success rate. We're saving 90% of the people. And so imagine being in a place where you could change a pediatric protocol, a seizure protocol. You could do innovation in cardiac arrest management, stroke. And we have done so many really big projects that have impacted millions and millions of people that I realize that I belong in this place where I can have a much bigger impact than the 30, 35 patients a shift. And slowly but surely, I went down in my shifts all the way down until finally I was full-fledged EMS. I'm now board certified. It's a subspecialty of emergency medicine, which is relatively new, almost like maybe 13, 14 years old. And that's where I belong.
That's great to find your calling. Were you one of the first certified in that subspecialty then?
When the test was offered, I was able to kind of grandfather into taking the test, and I took it and passed it as one of the earliest ones, yes. I don't know what number I was. It's probably on my cert somewhere up there. But now, in order to become an EMS medical director, you now have to go through a a fellowship program. And just this year, we now have the most recent accreditation for our fellowship. So we now are training 2 fellows a year. We've given them vehicles. And so now we are now in the process of training the next generation of EMS physicians. Wonderful specialty, most amazing people. And it's what I call the socialized medicine, because the taxpayers pay for it. The patients, usually will get, if they get a bill, it's very minor compared to what the hospital will give you. And we show up every time. You can call 911 100 times a day. Don't do that, but you can. And we'll always show up. We're not run for profit. We just do what's right for the community. And it gives people like me the ability to convince my team why we should be doing things that are very innovative. And we do those things. We publish on those things. And a lot of people look to South Florida now in EMS as, we've become really a hotbed for innovation, and our outcomes are through the roof, which is really the most important thing for me.
Kind of going back to what you said there, you created a different system to get rid of the tape and to get rid of the wooden stick. And it sounds like you had immediate interest, right? You had people coming up and taking the pamphlets or the cards, whatever they were printed on. But in healthcare, as you know, there's a lot of, we've always done it this way, and who do you think you are trying to change it kind of mentality. And so were you able to just easily change the protocol or the way things have been done, or did you face any resistance along the way and, shifting from this height system to basing it off of age?
Yeah, I tell you what, that just a question kind of brings me back. It's funny how, now when people look at it, they're like, oh my God, that must have been so easy to do. No, early on, my own colleagues, when I would go to a conference and they see me coming down the hall, they wouldn't even make eye contact with me. My own hospital, there were doctors in my own hospital who were behind the scenes trying to block what I was doing. My own hospital, when I told you I was giving these talks around the country, they said, when you go and you stand up on a stage anywhere in this world, you are never to mention that you work here. That's how bad it was. Now, a few people along the way, who I'll always be, very grateful for, they believed in me. And I had to fight like hell. And remember, early on, I wasn't selling anything. All I was trying to do was get this system that I had figured out. Now that we got these books, all I wanted to do is for the hospital to put the books into the code room so I can use them. I wasn't going to charge them $1. And finally, someone, went to bat for me. We got it in there. And then next thing you know, people started hearing that we're actually selling something. But I could tell you it took a good 8 years. And here we are 15 years later. And there are still a lot of people around this country who, when they hear what we're doing, they just dismiss it. They've never looked into it. They've never called. They never got a webinar, nothing. They just say, what he's doing can't be true. Even though there's peer-reviewed publications, people from around the country, there's, we're in use in 2,500 cities, close to 100 hospitals, the biggest hospitals in the country. And still, you will have people out there in academia who will say, I don't believe what he's doing. It's fascinating. Like, you could write a book on innovation in healthcare, and I'm sure that every innovation starts the same way, goes through the 10-year cycle. So when people call me today and say, hey, I got an idea, and even if it's the best idea, I said, you have 10 years? Because that's how long it's going to take you to prove yourself out that this thing works, get the research done, just do what it takes. And if 100 people at first tell you you're wrong, you're probably onto something. That's kind of like the best innovation in medicine. Usually, even the smartest people will disagree with what you're doing. And we see the same thing now with whole blood. We had really smart people telling us that we're wrong. And when it's quite obvious that if a person is bleeding out, you give them blood, they'll probably do better. And that's just healthcare.
There's got to be, it can't be that hard to prove, right? It shouldn't take 8 to 10 years for you to prove that, hey, look at the data before we started using Handtevy in this hospital or this facility. and then look at it after, right? I mean, how many years of data do they need to look at to see that you're saving more lives and
Yeah.
saving time, and saving stress on the clinicians, everything, right?
Well, listen, there's 2 landmark papers, one in 2019 in one of the biggest journals, Resuscitation. And the guy who did it was Paul Banerjee. Like, I've promised I will never publish on my own product, because you read it, it's fixed, right? So other people publish on it. He had 2 years, 38 children went to cardiac arrest, 0 survivors. Okay. The following 2 years, he had 23% survival. So he went from 0% to 23% neuro intact, meaning normal, the kids were playing soccer again, right? The American Heart Association cited that paper and said, yep, and I'm paraphrasing, yep, we saw that paper, but it was really hard to say how exactly all those kids came back to life. So they just disregard what we found. And by the way, there's another paper in 2022 out of Denver Health, very big system, that found 89% successful dosing with Handtevy, compared to what the tape that they were using in the past was about 51% success. So you have 2 dramatic papers that anyone would look at it and say, like, when they got published, I said, this is it. But what happens is those really smart people, they look at it and they'll say, well, we want more. We want a larger study. We want a randomized controlled trial. We want thousands of patients, not hundreds of patients. And it's the same story over and over again. And I've gotten to a point where I've said, I'm not going to fight those people, because I have such a big community of hundreds of thousands of people who trust us, who listen to what we say. We're very close with all of the people who use our product. We have a big team now, and we stay connected with our customer and our client base. But I just recognize now that there's some people on the very end of the bell curve who are never going to believe what I say. And that's just the way that it is. Like, it's not an individual person. What I've recognized and come to realize, that's just how the world works. And you got to just fight like hell and prove them wrong in a nice way. Never angry, never mean, never get upset with people if they don't adopt our product. I smile and say, okay, we're here if you need us. And that's just the way that we've held ourselves. And maybe in 20, 30 years from now, or maybe when I'm not here any longer, then everybody will be using it. But it does take a lot of time, unfortunately.
Well, and if I could comment on that as well, I think some of the things, so first I just want to say that one of the things I appreciate about what you've done with your website is that you actually do link to all those studies, which is really helpful. And so if anybody's interested, I would recommend that they take a look at those studies to see exactly what you're talking about. The other thing that I would say is, I think there's kind of a natural, like, what I'll say sometimes to my team here, and we do healthcare consulting, we're in the technology space, but I'll say to new people, like, one of the things you need to be aware of is that medicine is very conservative, and I think it has a lot with, first, do no harm. So if we know something works, we don't want to replace it too quickly with something else that might work better until we're more confident. And I think that is part of what you have to fight against when you're innovating in healthcare. And so I offer that just because I agree with you. I don't think it's, I'm certain there are individuals who thrive on that sometimes, but it's not generally individuals. It's more of a cultural reality in medicine. And one of the things that I think is interesting is you're on the side of it now where outcomes are, not that outcomes are never important, they're always important in healthcare, but you're on the side of it where outcomes are immediately evident. Like, immediately we can see, are we saving this patient or not? And you were with emergency medicine, but once you move to EMS, like, you've got to just stabilize and get them into the hospital as quickly as possible. And I think that brings to the fore more of a willingness, and tell me if I'm wrong, but culturally more of a willingness to innovate and to take some risks, because you're already at a point where you're pushed to the boundaries, to the edges of what's happening in medicine. And so innovation, if it can save even 10 lives over the ones that, over the baseline, then it's worth considering, right?
Well, we were just having this conversation because on October 22nd, the American Heart Association put out guidelines, and one of their recommendations is something that we wholeheartedly disagree with. And it goes exactly what you're saying. And what was it? If you have a patient who's in ventricular fibrillation, meaning they're dead, their heart is just fibrillating, it's quivering. You do CPR, you apply the pads, and you shock the patient. If the shock doesn't work, well, you only have one other choice, which is to keep doing CPR and to shock every 2 minutes. Keep doing CPR and to shock every 2 minutes. And we know that the patient has no chance. Once you start to get past 3, 4 shocks, we know that the end is near. So in 1994, a cardiologist decided to put 2 defibrillators on at the same time. 1994. And they pushed the buttons at almost the same exact time. And in 5 out of 5 patients, they all lived. They all survived. So from that point, multiple case reports were published, and case reports, and they're case reports, so they're not like the randomized controlled trial. But then in 2022, they published in the New England Journal a randomized controlled trial of dual sequential defibrillation. Now, we have been doing it for 7 years already. We have a lot of saves. October 22, 2025, the American Heart Association comes out and says, we don't agree. We do not recommend. And so, but to your point that you just mentioned, which is these people have one other option. They're going to die. There's a randomized controlled trial here that shows you that you can double survival by using a second defibrillator. Why wouldn't you do that? And we're not talking about 10 years. We're talking 30 years of data. So it's funny that I find myself now, we did it for pediatrics. We're doing it for adult cardiac arrest. We've done a lot for stroke. We've set up an entire registry. We've made all the data transparent across the state of Florida. We've done it for seizures. It almost seems like in healthcare, there's so many things that could be improved upon. But Ben, to go back to what you said earlier, it's like, for whatever reason, things just don't happen. But we now know the recipe. I know the formula of how to get things like this out, and with social media, obviously with our publications, there is a way, because there are people out there who want to listen. So to all the people who are out there who are innovating, and I tell my kids this, find 2 people who like your idea, then find 5 more, and then 100. And then over time, you'll have hundreds of thousands. And all of a sudden, it's not just your voice, it's everybody's voice. And when they look around now and say that Handtevy is being used in 2,500 cities and close to 100 hospitals, all of a sudden that changes their mind, because they say, you know what, let me call that hospital. Let me call that agency. And we say, great. And next thing you know, you start to get the word of mouth and people start adopting it because they see social proof. We show them the literature. They see our reputation, what we've done. And so I think that people will make decisions in healthcare, just like they make decisions in life, but they need a lot of different inputs before they can flip the switch. So we've learned that, and now we understand how to create change, not just locally, but we're trying to create change nationally. And that's really what we're set up to do, not just in pediatrics, but in all aspects of emergency care, which is very fun. I mean, I love it. I'm saying?
And you said 2,500 cities, right?
2,500 cities, yeah.
So 100 hospitals, 2,500 cities. And some of those hospitals, I know when we talked offline, you mentioned some that they're some of the leading hospitals.
Cleveland Clinic, we're in all their hospitals. Memorial Hermann, we're in all of their hospitals. We're on every cruise line. We're on majority of the helicopters that fly medical patients. We have a lot of government, can't say everybody, but we have a lot of governmental entities who utilize us. And again, it's not rocket science, but part of the secret sauce that I didn't mention is probably worth mentioning a little bit, is that the only way this works is if you have what I call extreme customization, meaning I cannot go to a fire department or to an ER and say, here's an app, it's generic, it'll get you 90% of the way there. You can't do that. We have to work for a month or 2 with the pharmacy or with the EMS team, and we say, we're going to ingest all the information that you have, and we're going to make an application that is 100% accurate with exactly what you have, rather than, only 90%. And so it's that customization that we have put a lot of work into. Our back-end software is very complicated to make sure that we can flex and move with that certain department. And that's how we were able to differentiate ourselves, because there are a lot of other people who are trying to just say, oh, I can do that. But they don't realize how hard it is to do the customization of every medication dose. And then lastly, I'll say that we have made it a promise that our app will never be a calculator. Why is that important? Because we review every single math equation before it goes to the customer. There are people out there whose their app is a calculator, and invariably there's so many inputs that go into this dose that one unit that's wrong or one decimal that's wrong, and you get a big overdose. So we absolutely do not allow any calculations to happen in our application, which is very hard to do also. So it's a lot of work. You need a lot of kind of people in the background, pharmacists, professors, nurses, clinical team to make all the magic happen. It takes a lot of work on the front end that people don't see. The end user doesn't see that.
You know, I told you we were going to have a little bit different episode today, and Mike and I usually bring folks on and we really focus on the tech. But after speaking with you, I wanted to share your story with the audience. And, you know, I think it's good for people to understand the level of grit and, I guess, conviction that you should probably have in addressing a problem in healthcare, because it hasn't been an easy road for you to get to where you are now. And so, you know, I want to tip my hat to you there. If we could go in a technical direction for just the last couple of minutes, it sounds like a lot of the things that you're doing, especially on the EMS side, that's good data that you would want to have available in the acute care setting when the patient arrives at the hospital. Is there any level of integration or interoperability between Handtevy and EMR systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as the EMR, let's talk about first the pre-hospital EMR. So there's a couple of large players in the pre-hospital EMR setting, and those are, you know, ESO, Image Trend, First Do. There's a couple of big players, and then there's about 10 or 11 smaller players. We've integrated with all of those. So on the EMS side, once someone is using Handtevy and they've done all the things, it's like basically one tap. It's not very complicated. Like I'm giving the drug. At the very end, you say submit. And, you know, we have APIs to each of those vendors. And basically the information goes seamlessly right into their EMR discreetly. It's really nice. It's as if, not almost as if, it's as if the medic was doing it themselves. Years ago, this is probably worth telling, that we actually went into the Epic App Orchard and also Cerner's platform as one of the very first Smart on Fire applications. We built a beautiful interface so you could be in Epic, click on Handtevy, boom, it shows up as if you're in Epic, and you give all the drugs. And here's the problem. When we press send, they would not allow us to go into the MAR, the Medication Administration Record, which is the source of truth for any medication that's administered. And we wondered why they wouldn't let us do that. And it turns out that they felt that our product would then make their product maybe not valuable. So they, as much as we tried and we begged and we pleaded, we flew out there, the whole 9 yards, they never allowed us to do that. So for those people out there who actually integrate with hospitals and use the Smart on Fire platform, it's expensive. Not only that, you have to have, insurance is greater than Fort Knox. You have to have all the SOC 2. Like we had all of that, and it was costing us a whole lot of money, but the hospitals would say no to us because they didn't have the MAR integration. So unfortunately, we've kind of put that on pause for now. And we still have a lot of hospitals who use us because they say, we don't care about the MAR. There are kids dying here, and we need your platform. So we hope to readdress it in the future, and we hope it becomes like the EMS side with our EMR integrations. And I think that day will come soon, I hope, anyway.
Well, it's good to have future goals. You know, if you had everything figured out now, you'd be bored, Pete. So it's great to have something out there on the horizon to go chase, right? So, Pete, lastly, we'll post links to Handtevy in the episode details, but for anybody curious to learn more or to have a conversation with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I love LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn, so you can definitely reach out to me there. Send me a note. I'd love to hear what you have to think about this episode or anything else. Our YouTube channel, there's tons and tons of content. I've made it a point that all the education, all the content is freely available. So we basically just, we create content that's really for the frontline clinician, and we just keep putting out great innovative content. And I think that's the best way on our website. But anyone who wants to reach out, would love to hear from you. Yeah.
It's been a really interesting conversation, Pete. Thanks again for joining us. This concludes another episode of the Next Orbit podcast. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, guys.
The Next Orbit podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.